This is the video for Chapter 6, Lesson 1. Chapter 6 is the Road to Revolution. It's going to focus on the causes of the American Revolution. And Lesson 1 is going to be the beginning where we start to look at those causes. Our objectives for this lesson, what we hope to get out of this, is to be able to identify why the Proclamation of 1763 angered so many of the colonists, describe the debate over taxes and troops in the colonies, explain the Stamp Act, and then discuss how the colonists forced Britain to repeal the Stamp Act. The Proclamation of 1763. After the French and Indian War, conflict began to rise between Great Britain and the English colonies. Prior to the war, the colonies were permitted to grow and develop as they chose. Now that the war was over, England wanted to limit the colonists' ability to expand in order to restrict colonial development. Colonists believed their freedom was being limited. The first laws that Parliament passed that infringed on this colonial freedom was the Proclamation of 1763. This law created a boundary line between the English colonies and what the English referred to as the Indian Reserve. This line was not intended to be permanent, but a temporary boundary, which would be extended further west as the government saw fit. The government also outlawed the private purchase of Native American land, as that had caused many problems in the past. All purchases of Indian land would have to be completed by Crown officials after meeting with Native leaders. The line temporarily prohibited the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Great Britain had to set this land aside for Native Americans in order to prevent another Indian revolt similar to Pontiac's rebellion. After the war, many colonists had received land grants in the fertile Ohio Valley. Many of these colonists had no land of their own, and they viewed this law as taking away their chance to make a better life for themselves and their families. Other colonists purchased this land as an investment. They hoped to develop the land and make a large profit. As a result, many people ignored the law and continued moving into the area. These colonists petitioned the British government to move the line further west. As a result, the boundary line was adjusted several times after treaties were made with the Native Americans. These treaties opened up much of what is now West Virginia, Kentucky, to the English settlement. This did not, however, get rid of the bad feelings that the colonists had about the original law. In order to enforce the Proclamation of 1763, King George III decided to keep roughly 10,000 British soldiers in America after the French and Indian War. The main reason for keeping these soldiers in America was because demobilizing the army would put about 1,500 officers, many of whom were well connected in Parliament, out of work. The colonists were not particularly thrilled to have the British regulars inhabiting their towns and cities. These soldiers needed to be paid, supplied with rations, and housed. Lieutenant General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in America, increasingly found it difficult to persuade colonial assemblies to pay for these troops. In 1765, Parliament passed a law known as the Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act was a cost-saving measure that required the colonists to quarter or house the British soldiers and provide them with the needed supplies. Many colonists were angered by this law, as no standing army was kept in America prior to the war. Why did they need one now that the war was over? As part of William Pitt's plan to win the French and Indian War, England had incurred a great debt during that time. Keeping these troops in America would continue to raise the debt even higher. Britain not only needed to find ways to reduce the money they were spending, but they also needed to find ways to raise revenue. Revenue is income coming into the country. Parliament looked at their participation in the French and Indian War as benefiting the colonists. The size of the colonies grew. Even if the colonists couldn't move into this new territory, the French were out of the picture, and for the time being, the natives should have been satisfied with their situation. They felt that the colonists should be responsible for bearing some of the burden of the debt from the war, also for the continued defense of the Western Territory. In the past, the king would ask the colonial assemblies to pass new taxes to support these military actions. However, this time, Parliament decided to tax Americans directly. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law placed a tax on sugar, molasses, and other products shipped to the colonies. More importantly, it called for strict enforcement of the law and punishment for anyone who smuggled these goods into America. What's interesting is that Parliament had previously placed a tax on these items with the Molasses Act of 1733, but in most cases the colonists evaded this tax. The new Sugar Act would actually reduce the tax rate in half, but this time the British planned on enforcing the law. Great Britain, with their acquisition of Canada, believed that there would be new demand for molasses and rum, which is a byproduct of the sugar, in the colonies. They believed that by actually lowering the rate, combined with the increased demand, that they could raise a lot of money, and that the colonists would be very happy to pay this. Many colonial leaders, like James Otis, pictured here on our slide, spoke openly against this measure. Speaking before a Massachusetts provincial assembly, Otis argued that taxation without representation is tyranny. This statement became the basic patriot position and catchphrase leading into the American Revolution. Colonists didn't believe that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies, since colonists could not elect their own representatives to Parliament. George Grenville, the British finance minister, disagreed with the colonists. He believed they were subjects of the crown, and they enjoyed the protection of its laws, and for that reason, they were subject to taxation. Along with James Otis, Samuel Adams was one of the main people behind the protests against the Sugar Act. By August of 1764, many Boston merchants agreed to stop purchasing British imports. In both Boston and New York, there were movements to increase colonial manufacturing. By 1766, Parliament was forced to repeal the Sugar Act. In 1765, English Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This law required all legal and commercial documents to carry an official stamp showing that the tax had been paid. Official documents included diplomas, contracts, wills, marriage license, playing cards, etc. Even published materials such as newspapers and pamphlets had to be written on special stamped paper. This money would be used to help pay for the English military presence in the colonies. Parliament believed that the colonies were the primary beneficiaries of the military presence. Why shouldn't they pay for it? The stamp tax was a new type of tax on the colonies. The sugar tax was an indirect tax on imported goods. Its main impact was felt mostly by the colonial merchants. The stamp tax was a tax applied within the colonies. It had a direct impact on all colonists. To make matters worse, the tax had to be paid with silver coin, which was rare in the colonies. Colonial leaders were angered by the Stamp Act. The issues were clear for them. They were being taxed by Parliament without their consent. Since they had no representation, they had no voice. If England could pass this law, what would be next? This violated their rights as Englishmen to be taxed without their consent. Some colonists, like Virginia's Patrick Henry, called for resistance on the tax. On May 30th, 1765, Henry proposed the Virginia Resolves, which basically said that they would try not to pay the stamp tax. Other members of the House of Burgesses shouted that resistance was treason, and Patrick Henry says, if this be treason, then make the most of it. Samuel Adams, who's pictured here, was another one of the Massachusetts politicians who was against the Stamp Acts. Prior to becoming a politician, Adams had attended Harvard, and he hoped to work in business. His first employer fired him because he was so interested in politics that he had no time to worry about business. He felt that he wasn't going to be a very good merchant, so he let him go. After that, his father gave him about 1,000 pounds of coin, which was a lot of money at the time, and he was supposed to use that money to establish his own business. He ended up lending half of the money to his friend that would never get repaid, and the other half he spent frivolously on this or that, sparking one of his contemporaries to remark that Sam Adams is not a man interested in making or possessing money, period. Adams worked for a while at the family malt house, which made malt that then can be later turned into beer. That business also failed. It was at that time that he became involved in politics, just in time for this revolutionary spirit to be heading through Massachusetts. As we said, colonial resistance to the Stamp Act was widespread. We've already talked about Patrick Henry. In October 1765, 9 of the 13 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City. This would mark the first time that the colonies would meet to consider acting together in protest. Delegates drew up a petition to the king protesting the Stamp Act. The petition declared the right to tax the colonies belonged to the colonial assemblies and not Parliament. Colonial merchants also organized a boycott or a refusal to purchase goods. Secret societies or organizations like the Sons of Liberty were formed. This group extended throughout the colonies and led to the development of a pattern for future resistance to the British. Committees were created within secret organizations to correspond with the other colonies. The Sons relied on large public demonstrations to expand their organization. Many of the demonstrations turned violent and destructive. The protesters burned stamped paper whenever they could find it. They attacked customs officials, whom they would cover with boiling hot tar and feathers, and then they would parade them through the public. Many British customs officials resigned from their posts out of fear. The Stamp Act protests were effective. By 1766, both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act had been repealed by Parliament. Several parliamentary leaders, such as William Pitt, agreed with the American thinking about taxing the colonies. Pitt was extremely outspoken against the Stamp Act. If you look in your textbook, you can read his quote about taxation on the colonies on page 146. While Parliament was repealing the Stamp and Sugar Acts, they passed a third law known as the Declaratory Act. This law was also passed in 1766, and it gave Parliament the supreme authority to govern the colonies, i.e., they could make any laws they wanted to, representation or not. The colonies celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act, and they tried to ignore the Declaratory Act.